Hi, I'm Alicia.
And I'm Robin, and you're listening to Bowel Moments,
the podcast sharing real talk about the realities of IBD. Served on the rocks. This week, we talked to self-described IBD dinosaur Dewey Thom. We talked to him about his long journey with Crohn's disease, including pouchitis, strictures, and obstruction. We talked to him about volunteering as a support group facilitator and the importance of getting support from people who truly understand, and also how important it is to give support and share your story, and about how that has also come about with his volunteering with Camp Oasis. We also talked to him about accidental college majors. Cheers!
Welcome to Bowel Moments. This is Robin.
Hey guys, this is Alicia, and we are really excited to have Dewey Thom with us. Dewey, I think you may have started the IBD community at the rate you're going. So we're very excited to have you on. But before you tell us your story, we always start out with a very unprofessional question of what are you drinking?
We'll go with the imaginary Sazerac, but it's actually tea and water.
What is in a Sazerac? Because you suggested this to us when we were in New Orleans. What is in it?
Good question. I believe it is some kind of whiskey.
Okay.
And something else.
All right. Sounds good. Well, we'll have to look it up.
Unique to, I believe, New Orleans, actually.
I think
it was invented in New Orleans.
Robin would know. Robin, she's saying she's on mute, but she's saying it was. Robin, as you take yourself on mute, what are you drinking?
Just for everyone to know, I have a problem with the mute button. I mean, this is not going to air on this day, obviously, but it is National Rum Day. You pointed that out to me. I really wanted to have a rum cocktail, but I had a work call up until 5 minutes before this call started. So in a mad dash to the fridge, I grabbed a cider. You know, it's my Old Faithful. I keep it in there just in case. So I would love to have made a really delicious mojito or maybe even a strawberry daiquiri with fresh strawberries with the rum. But here we are. I'm back to cider.
Well, maybe tomorrow or later you can make yourself a rum cocktail to make up for it. But I am celebrating National Rum Day because I sent it to you in all caps, so I was pretty excited about it. I made myself a pina colada, so I'm feeling very tropical right now. Well, Dewey, please tell us your IBD story. What brings you to our IBD community?
Many years. I'm an IBD dinosaur, I'd like to say. So I was diagnosed over 40 years ago, and as I also, how do I put this without being too graphic? Well, but it's an IBD podcast, so it kind of becomes graphic, I guess. But I was scoped before they invented the flexible sigmoidoscopy.
Oh, yikes! What? How is that possible?
Yeah, so I don't remember a lot from many years ago, from childhood, etc. And but I do sadly remember the long metal tube. That is how they used to scope me. So another fun fact, so to speak. Some patients talk about getting their flexible sig without sedation, and it's like, you know what? Nope. I don't want to know anything that's going on back there. Just put me out. So for those of you were more recently diagnosed and weren't diagnosed 40 years ago, be thankful for the invention, whoever it was, who invented the flexible sigmoidoscopy. And I was diagnosed kind of classically back then as a adolescent, and back then 40 years ago, as opposed to today, patients weren't really diagnosed as adolescents, whereas today that seems to be where the balloon, so to speak, is of patient diagnoses. And my doctor said to me, after a battery of, quite frankly, invasive, insulting, dignity-losing exams, he sat across me and said, "So you have a disease which is more commonly found in people of Jewish descent and people who are middle-aged. You're neither, but you have this disease." So there you have it. I mean, the good news was I was diagnosed because, quite frankly, prior to that, it was the typical type of story with many IBD patients, pediatricians who were great doctors at, large university hospital in New York, basically said, he's just got a nervous stomach. He will be fine. He doesn't have anything wrong with him. So after a year or so of going through trouble to being diagnosed, but that's the dinosaur in me. It wasn't a fun experience, but we're still here 40 plus years later. So for those of you who are more recently diagnosed, you can live.
Yeah, that's a long time ago. So you were an adolescent when you were diagnosed. Was there any treatment available to you? What did they do to help you?
Excellent question. So back then, there was the whopping use of asulfidine, which is less commonly used today, a sulfur-based product, which was a predecessor to the lovely first-line therapy, mesalamine today, which is available in, I don't know, half a dozen different concoctions at this point. But there was no mesalamine. There was asulfidine and a maximum dose of 15, maybe 20 milligrams of prednisone, believe it or not. So that was the therapy at the time, and that was it. They eventually started using cortisone enemas, but not the fancy cortifoam enemas. For those of you, if you know, you know. But yeah, that was it. There was no biologics, no use of actually the immunomodulators, i.e. second-line therapy, methotrexate, azathioprine, tacrolimus, etc. So yeah, it was limited therapy. Probably that's why I ended up, after my second hospitalization, which was about 9 years out from diagnosis, my second hospitalization, I got progressively worse, didn't respond to the same therapy, which I had initially on my first hospitalization, which was like in and out 3 days. I was better and on my way back to living my life. But the second hospitalization, it was 4 weeks of complete misery, getting progressively worse. Same therapy, which was, well, at the time it was TPN as well, but 15 or 20 milligrams of prednisone, asulfidine, that was it. There was nothing else that was there to be treated with. At some point, the doctor came in and was like, so we think you should consider surgery. To be honest, it was like, okay. I was, quote unquote, as I say to patients now who are facing surgery, I was lucky because I was so sick, so miserable that the decision was actually a relief at the time. So hence my beginning of my J-pouch journey. And here I am, a relative J-pouch dinosaur as well, because curiously, it was actually the second surgery. My initial GI wanted me to have an ileostomy, permanent ileostomy, because that was the standard of care at the time. Unbeknownst to me, the second opinion GI came in and said, well, there's this other surgery where you can have an ileostomy for a few months, and then we'll reverse it after a few months and reconnect you, and you'll have your plumbing generally intact, and you will evacuate as a ordinary human, so to speak, by sitting down on the toilet. And like, oh, okay, well, option number 2 sounds a little more, quote unquote, normal to me, so let's go with that. But they never mentioned that it was a new surgery, so in hindsight, I'm glad they didn't, because, it was about, give or take, 5 years old at the time, and had they said it was a new surgery, I probably would have well, I don't know, et cetera. So anyway, so there you go. So I ended up having J-pouch surgery, and 36 years later, as a relative veteran of J-pouch surgery, and for fun, an amended diagnosis, which happened probably 16, 17 years ago as I moved to California, of Crohn's disease versus ulcerative colitis, based on clinical examination, I guess as my doctor put it. Initially when my doctor said that, I was, of course, in denial. I had a great surgeon in New York. The pathology report said, ulcerative colitis throughout the colon, blah, blah, blah. But, 30 odd years ago, medical technology versus medical technology today, was it a misdiagnosis? Who knows? Who cares? It doesn't matter. I have Crohn's disease. The clear evidence is I respond to the newer biologics, the medication. It improves my quality of life. It took me a year to get to that point to accept the fact that I had Crohn's disease and I had to treat it as such, as opposed to refusing to admit that that's what I had, versus pouchitis. But, quite honestly, better quality of life by treating it with the medications available today. And thankful that they exist, quite frankly. So
I am surprised, and I'm surprised that your surgeon was like, hey, let's do this, with hardly any experience at all. That's very brave on the surgeon's part, but also, I guess, if you would have known it, brave on your part, because that's intimidating to be like, let's just try this thing that's brand new.
So to be fair, the surgeon wasn't that new at it. He
good.
had trained at Mayo Clinic, which was, considered the place to train. And he was considered an extraordinarily talented surgeon. By accident, he happened to be someone we actually knew. He was like a family friend, so to speak. So just literally completely by accident, he walked in and was like, oh, and my mother's like, oh, I know you. So he had been through extensive training at Mayo Clinic. And he was, after the surgery, literally everyone, back then there were multitude of nurses on every floor, and every nurse was like, you've got the best surgeon, he's great, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. So
Well, that's good.
And yeah.
So
Yes,
I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. You've had your J pouch for 36 years. Is that what you said?
36 years. That is correct.
That is
No
so
lie.
encouraging to me because, you hear numbers about J pouches lasting 20 years. And since mine is a brand new, shiny 1-year-old, I would like to think that I could have it for 36, 35 more years. That would make me so happy. Take me well into my 80s. I feel like that would be the ideal situation. Have you had to have any other medical interventions since you got your Crohn's diagnosis because of your pouch? I'm asking you this question because I heard a surgeon, actually 2 surgeons, do education programs, and they were talking about pouchitis and how if it's reoccurrent and doesn't respond to like antibiotic treatment and stuff, it is very likely to be Crohn's and not classic pouchitis because it's recurrent and you can't treat it, with just antibiotics. So have you found that you're having a much better experience since you started the biologics and there's not that reoccurrence of pouchitis? But I guess too, since your surgery was so long ago, like, have you had reversions? Have you had problems with it in that sense too?
Great questions. Understandable questions with your shiny new J pouch, by all means, and quite frankly, your history of amended diagnosis as well. So yeah, I mean, long story short is arguably I had a history in the course of 19 years before the amended diagnosis of, call it probably without measuring, because who measures how sick you are and how frequently you're sick, quite frankly, probably every 18 months of having pouchitis. And then when I got here to California, when I moved across the country, what was happening was I was getting pouchitis not once every 18 months, but once every 3 months. Hence, my doctor making the clinical decision that looks like you have Crohn's, not pouchitis. And then of course my refusal, but then within roughly a year, Remicade, which was brand new at the time, and the first biologic being used for IBD started that, and it took a few months, but once it kicked in, it was like, oh my God, is this what life is like without being sick all the time? So yeah, the changing diagnosis is difficult to accept. I see patients doing it all the time and struggling with it, and the same kind of classic, it's like what I try to say to patients is like, look, it's fine. Be angry, scream, shout, punch a punching bag, don't punch a plaster ball because that might hurt, and do whatever you need to do and be angry. But at the end of the day, probably smart, assuming you're seeing an IBD specialist, to go ahead and proceed with trying to improve your quality of life, which would inherently probably mean going on a biologic to bring the Crohn's under control, and hopefully you end up with an improved quality of life. And, my life is honestly far from perfect. I have Crohn's disease and a J pouch, generally not a good combination, but, I still manage to do a lot of things. I just got back from Europe. I run many half marathons. I, travel a fair amount, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, you can go on and have a decent life, if you will. You're not going to have a perfect life. We have a chronic disease. Honestly, even when they find a cure, I don't know what that means to a patient like me, but not that I'm not hoping for it, but, but truthfully, I don't know what that means to someone like myself,
Right.
Given everything I've been through.
Also, who has a perfect life, even if they don't have a chronic disease? So, I mean, what's the
Excellent point.
expectation there?
No
What is
one.
the expectation there, right?
No one.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No. And that's extremely fair. But, but people kind of, I think patients kind of struggle with that, a lot.
Yeah.
I think I answered your questions.
Yeah,
Even if I
you did.
Okay.
In the roundabout way that I asked them, yes, you did.
Can I ask perhaps a remedial question for the audience and for you guys, but what does it feel like when you have pouchitis? How do you know? Like, is it different than when you had your colon and you were flaring? What does it feel like?
So that's interesting. So honestly, arguably, I don't think I've faced pouchitis for many, many years since I've been on biologics, but I think the best description of it is essentially it's accelerated ulcerative colitis, so to speak. You've got pain, probably feverish, probably rampant bowel movements, often uncontrolled, all of that. You're probably, because of all of that, going to run into dehydration, which then creates a whole nother mess of problems if you don't get in front of it. So pouchitis is essentially, call it UC on fire. because you don't have a colon anymore. So, you just got less body or less organ to help the body manage the inflammation, which is what itis means, right? ITIS, attached to any organ, is inflammation of X organ, the preceding organ. Fun fact.
And I haven't actually had pouchitis, thankfully, it just a year in, but I did have, the IRA for 20 years, which is my small intestine, my ileum was connected directly to what was left of my rectum, which essentially was 4 or 5 inches of rectum. And so whenever my rectum was inflamed, which is one of the things that led to my eventual Crohn's diagnosis, that's it. It was like when I had the UC diagnosis, but just amplified. I mean, I just remember pain, burning, just bowel movements like so often, and wanting to lay on the bathroom floor because it was cool, right? The fever, you talked about having a fever, like it just was, it was not comfortable. So I'm assuming that that's probably similar to the pouchitis experience.
Yeah, that they sound similar. They both sound very unpleasant. Okay. Dewey, right before we hit record, you and I were talking, as Robin was jumping on, about strictures. And so that's another thing you have struggled with. Is this something that has been part of your Crohn's, ulcerative colitis / Crohn's the whole time? Or is this something more recent post J-pouch?
Good question. So what I would, and this is actually part of my rationale and description to other patients who face the amended diagnosis. I believe, although I don't have medical evidence of it, that I have strictures that were developed probably during that year that I punted starting biologics on my doctor's advice with the Crohn's amended diagnosis. Because essentially strictures, from my understanding, and I'm not an expert necessarily, certainly not a medical professional, but strictures typically happen with constant unmitigated inflammation, which basically scar the tissue, the intestinal tissue, which then narrows the tissue, which then creates a stricture, which is, in a very straightforward sense, strictures are narrowing of the intestine, a tightening of the passageway, if you will. So my belief is that since I didn't initially start on biologics, and I essentially let the Crohn's continue to wreak havoc for, call it roughly a year before I started the biologics, that uncontrolled inflammation caused the strictures that I have. If you have strictures as a J-poucher, my strictures happen to be mid-pouch and at the pouch inlet, as opposed to many J-pouchers also end up having strictures in the rectum or the anal passage, which by definition, because it's easier to reach, easier to treat. But having a stricture in the middle of your J-pouch becomes a little more complex. And unfortunately, that the strictures in and of themselves make one prone to several things. Number one, probably anemia, because the tissue is friable, which means it's prone to bleeding. And 2, obstructions, which there was a period in my life a few years back where I honestly was getting obstructions to the tune of probably, no idea, 6 times a year, probably ending up in the ER 3 times a year from them. When you have them, they are the most incredibly painful thing in the world, which led me to pray to every known god, including all the pagan gods, for relief. And to illustrate how painful and unpleasant it is, one time I get to the ER and I say to the doctor, please insert an NG tube. So for those who don't know, an NG tube is a nasal gastric tube. It's pretty unpleasant. No one ever likes them. But if you have an obstruction, they work because they essentially relieve the peristalsis pressure that is happening, that's trying to constantly basically force its way down, yet running into an obstruction, which then creates the waves of pain that are often associated with obstructions. And it was funny because the doctor's like, you want me to do what? It's like, yeah, I want you to put in an NG tube. I mean, I literally thought I was dying. The pain was that intense. And from past experience, I knew that the NG tube would relieve that pressure. So not fun, but it works. But so obstructions. And unfortunately, I just had yesterday, as you guys intimately know, and we were at risk of not having this conversation today because I thought I might land in the hospital, but somehow or another, magically last night around midnight, things started passing again. I don't have an explanation for the obstruction this time, but prior to, in the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I have explanations. So it's a little unnerving, quite frankly, having not been through obstructions for many years now. Again, not living on a perfect life, but a relatively good life and a relatively active, busy life, etc. The obstructions are, to say the least, pretty disruptive. And it was kind of interesting. I don't know if you guys see and watch or follow Jake Diekman, the professional ball player, and his Gutted Out Foundation. But last week, I think he posted one of those, I don't know if it's a meme, a poster, whatever. And it's like essentially something to the effect of chronic disease is a life where you wake up every day and you don't know necessarily what you're going to face. That's what it was like yesterday for me.
Yeah. Well, and we were talking about how intimidating that is because you weren't in the United States, you weren't near your doctor, you still had to get on a plane. And so it happened at a time when it was particularly inconvenient, even though like it's never convenient for this to happen, but at a time when it's particularly inconvenient and scary for you to face.
Yeah, obstructions are never fun. But yeah, I won't go into the gory details, which we did before already.
No.
About obstructions and flying, but yeah, something that you don't want to do.
No. And based on our previous conversations with, I think, both Josie and Dr. Tiffany Taft, NG tubes are traumatic experiences for people. So the fact that you asked for it, really, you were in real bad shape. You were in real pain. So I'm sorry to hear that. Hearing your story, one of the things that strikes me is that, you've had these experiences, but you remain a very positive person overall. And part of you being a very positive person is that you've decided to use this to go into a couple of different places where you provide support for other people living with these diseases. And that's really impressive. One of them is a support group and one of them is Camp Oasis. So I want to ask you about both of those, but we can talk about whichever one you want to talk about first. But both of these are really great opportunities to provide support. How did you get involved with them? And, talk to us about your volunteering.
Sure. So I've also been extraordinarily active in Team Challenge, the Team Challenge of running program for the foundation. And because of that, one season, maybe my third season, this is quite frankly, I think a funny story, but having been a patient as long as I've been, I honestly never thought I needed support. Like, what do I need support for? I'm 20 plus years into this. I've had surgery. What do I need to talk to other patients about? But anyway, so the local manager asked, because she wasn't a patient, asked myself and another patient to go and represent and talk about Team Challenge at the local support group. So we went happily to volunteer to do that and spread the good word about our experience in Team Challenge and how empowering it was, et cetera. And we go in and there's this big oval table. The room was relatively full, probably at least a dozen, probably 15 people in the room. We end up sitting adjacent to the facilitator, and I'm all excited as she's about to start. And she says, we're going to go around and everyone will kind of introduce themselves and then we'll proceed. So I'm thinking, all right, great. We start and then we leave. We're out of here. We get to go and paint the town red, if you will. But she started the other way. So I got to listen to 13, 14 different patients and caregivers. A couple of people there that were parents of kids who had been recently diagnosed. It was such an amazing experience that was, so probably 2010, 11, that honestly, if I'm now with the magic of Zoom and technology, I have called into the support group meetings that I would otherwise miss and feel badly that I missed from Hawaii, from New York, because it's just great to be in an environment where everyone gets it, if you will. Or maybe your experience can be helpful to another patient who's struggling. I had this dialogue with a patient recently who's an older gentleman and really struggling. He was diagnosed only 3 years ago. Essentially, has been facing the threat of colectomy, if you will, because he and I have a dialogue offline, apart from the support group. When we get to the support group, I don't think to engage him because I missed part of the story. Somewhere along the lines, call it 5 years ago, the lead facilitator asked me to be co-facilitator. So I'm now partially responsible for helping maintain the flow of the conversation in the support group. So back to this gentleman. So one time I realized, wait a second, I feel so bad. We didn't really engage you this last meeting. And he's like, don't worry about it. It's like, I'm just happy to be there, listen to stories, and possibly maybe share something that might be of benefit to another patient. That in and of itself for him is incredibly rewarding, not that he needs quote unquote answers from the meeting itself. And then that's what part of the magic of the support group is that there are all kinds of ways you can benefit by participating. We've had some patients who have literally just said, no, I'm happy just listening. It's, and they're not even at the severe disease stage. They just have mild disease, but because it's still relatively new to them, it's helpful to them to understand, how life may or may not progress, so to speak. So it's an amazing, I'm a great example. I didn't think I needed a support group. And, once you attend one, a good one, it's an amazing experience and it's incredibly beneficial in so many ways. On to Camp Oasis. I don't have kids, probably never will. That's a pretty good bet at this point. So, one of my fellow teammates had been volunteering for Camp Oasis, and he's like, we need male counselors. We have a shortage of male counselors who are patients, and like, you've got to come. And the old adage, if you don't step out of your comfort zone, you're never going to grow, kind of came to mind. And it's like, all right, fine, I'll volunteer for Camp Oasis, even though the thought terrified me. And I did it for 3 years, 3 years in person, 1 year virtually. It's an absolutely amazing experience, not just for the kids, but also for the counselors. It really, truly is. And for many of the kids, it's truly the first time that they've gotten to see another kid who has the same disease that they have. The impact of that is just, as you can imagine, just tremendous. I mean, as adults, quite frankly, many adults, the first time they come to our support group, it's the first time they're getting to talk to other patients beyond sitting in the sitting waiting area, type of thing, where they typically don't have a conversation and engage with other patients. But, for kids to be able to see that there are other kids who just like them, they're not the only person who's sick, who has this, quite honestly, sometimes miserable, difficult, challenging chronic disease. It's amazing. And then for them to get to see, quite honestly, counselors who are alive and thriving, and have managed through the disease process for a number of years. Maybe we're diagnosed. I mean, for me, it was incredibly rewarding. I was lucky to have the age group where I was diagnosed, 13 to 14 years, 13 to 15. So it was amazing to be able to sit with these kids who were literally the age that I was diagnosed, and many of them were newly diagnosed, so it was just tremendous experience. No one ever likes to hear that a kid got diagnosed. Just last night, 2 a.m. when I was feeling better on Facebook, don't ask me why, but somehow I decided to be on Facebook. There was a parent of a 12-year-old who is a new J-poucher. She was asking for suggestions, and like, the best thing I can tell you to do is please send your kid to Camp Oasis next summer. And I was happy to see this morning that she came back and said, actually, his doctor volunteers for Camp Oasis, and that's definitely part of the plan. So
that's awesome. And I would imagine it's especially meaningful to you because you were diagnosed with a Jewish old man disease. And, so I would imagine when you were that age, you didn't know anybody at all that had ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. And so you knew what it was like to be the only person. And so I think that's really remarkable. I'm sure it's really helpful for the children to hear your story and, to be able to go, hey, look at this guy. He's super successful and happy and lives, a life that is overall very good. We've all agreed now at this point that nobody's life is perfect, but he lives this great life and, and he travels and he had a great job and, and got to retire early enough to still be able to go to Hawaii and Europe and all these places. So I think that's really awesome. What a cool experience. And yes, camp is a really remarkable experience, I think, for anybody, even the counselors that are involved. So I'm glad you do that. That's really great. Talk a little bit more. I'm going to lead you back to the support group because I am curious, your experience having led the support group now for a little while, have you noticed any trends of people that come and go from support groups or the people that stay in support groups? I'm curious if there's like a type of person that decides to continue to attend. Like, can you predict somebody's longevity in the group when you talk to them?
Wow, it's fascinating. No, I can't. I don't think I can. So from my perspective as a person who is genuinely interested in other people and how they do, how they fare, how they progress, etc. When a new person shows up in support group and is often seeking help, is usually why they end up in the support group to begin with, because they're struggling. It's great to see that they found us, right? And then hopefully they get a fair amount of feedback from the group and have some ideas about where to go, avenues to explore so they can struggle less. I always think that's fantastic. I say to my co-facilitator, wow, what a great meeting. We got, so-and-so, hopefully pointed in a direction where he or she can, make some progress and not struggle so much, feel supported, etc. And then sometimes they don't show up the next meeting. It's like, what happened? What did we do wrong? And sometimes they keep showing up, even when they're doing well. So from my perspective, I haven't thought enough about it, but I'm mystified as to why people continue to come, why people stop stop coming. I mean, the simple answer is the people who come get answers, then do recover, so to speak, do well, figure out how to manage their life, get their questions answered. So logically, they don't come back because now they're doing okay and they don't feel the need, so to speak. But then, like the gentleman I mentioned earlier, who thankfully, quite frankly, he's now finally on a med that seems to have, I don't want to get ahead of myself and say eliminated, but certainly paused the threat of colectomy and doing much better, but he's still coming to the group. Why? Because he gets something out of just attending and maybe being able to help other patients, kind of like I do, quite honestly. To be perfectly candid at this point, given the many, many educational webinars and symposiums when we had things in person that I've attended and my longevity as a patient and, my conversations, my multiple conversations with my doctors, I'm not saying that there's nothing for me to learn, but most of what is out there, I've probably heard. So, am I really going to necessarily learn something new from the support group? Not necessarily, but that's not why I go. I go because to offer support and to hopefully let people know that you can live. Your life isn't necessarily cursed because you have a chronic disease and you're struggling. So if that's a long-winded answer to your question, I don't know. I don't know what the theory is behind why people continue to come and why people stop coming.
It does seem to be a little bit of a mystery. And yeah, you never know. I do think one thing that needs to be highlighted is the fact that you get as much out of the group, I think, if you come to be a support to somebody as you do coming to get support. And I think people perhaps don't realize that or don't think about it because people need to hear your story. If you figured something out and you've succeeded, or you had a successful surgery, or you figured out what drug to take, or you found a new doctor, people need to know that process. They want to hear your success stories. I think people have this idea that going to a support group is to be a bunch of people just, bitching and moaning and not necessarily being very sort of answer focused. So I don't know.
1000%. You are absolutely correct. Because to be honest, I was probably my image of a support group, right? Yeah. It was like, why do we need to go to a support group and hear people complain and moan and talk about their problems? If the support group is run well, ideally, that's not what the support group is. It's more about solutions and multiple solutions, quite frankly, because the disease is so complex that honestly, there's no linear directional guide to how you manage through inflammatory bowel disease. There just isn't. There's no simple answer. And to be able to get multiple viewpoints is, number one, helpful to patients, but for the patients who are sharing their own stories, is rewarding in and of itself. And to know that you can be supportive of another patient, another human being, is honestly magical. And that's kind of what Camp Oasis is, right? I mean, it's magical to be able to demonstrate and show to other patients who are maybe newer in their IBD journey that life is okay.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with that. I was 10 years into my diagnosis before I was in a situation where I was surrounded by people who also had the IBD diagnosis, and it just changed everything, right? Just being in that environment with people who were living like you, like living their lives and for the most part thriving, right? I wanted to be able to do that for other people. And I think that's the magic sauce, right? For people coming back to support groups who receive that support and want to be able to provide it for other people. So that's why you can't tell who's coming back. But I mean, for the reasons that you said, I always encourage anyone who has come to a support group and then been like, oh, I'm fixed, so I'm going to step away. I encourage them to come back and be that source of support for other people if they feel so, called to do that, because it just, even though we all have the diagnosis, the IBD diagnosis, at times it feels like we all have different diseases, right? So for me personally, when I found out I had to have J-pouch surgery, and Stacy, who's been a guest a couple of times, also found out that she had to have J-pouch surgery, we were like, okay, twins, we're going through this together. And we're literally like a month apart, for our first surgery and our last surgery. So just having that sense of support and being very fortunate to have someone that was going through the same thing as me, similarly, timeline wise, where we could say, is this normal or do I need to talk to my surgeon? Right? Are you experiencing this too? Or did you experience this too? And that also connected me to other people that had J-pouch surgery recently. So it was like I was able to build my own support network without going to the support group because I needed specific support in that situation. So, I mean, I'm a huge fan of building your support group, whether that's going to a support group or, building that network of support. But for anyone who's listening, if you're a patient, support groups are not what they show on TV shows. They genuinely can offer support to you or for you to offer support to someone else. And also, this is for life. Like, there are going to be ups and downs. There are going to be periods of remission and periods of active disease, and finding that, what's the phrase that the kids are saying nowadays? Finding your tribe. Finding the support system that, really gets it has been over the past 20 years. I can't even express the impact that it's had for me personally. That
expression, finding your tribe, is exactly what one of my friends who was a past co-facilitator literally said at one of the education symposiums as part of the patient panel. It's like, whatever it is, if it's a support group, if it's Team Challenge, if it's Camp Oasis, if it's just people, that you randomly assemble yourself, but finding your tribe of fellow IBD patients, honestly, is critical. And now that I have it, I don't even know how I lived for the 20 years before I discovered it.
Same. I don't know how I lived for the 10 years before discovering it.
It's a world of difference. It's so the classic expression, you're not alone, right? I mean, and quite honestly, and while we each have our own individual battles and there may be similarities, the truth of the matter is, all of that considered, it's important to understand that you're not alone. So find your tribe wherever you may find it. That's important.
That was beautiful, by the way, both of you. Sorry, I'll stop and acknowledge that and not gloss that over, because it's beautiful to hear that from people who, frankly, somebody like Robin, who's a little bit like not a joiner. I think that it's nice to hear that she's seeking that out, and that was something valuable for her, because again, as a non-joiner myself, I don't know that I would have sought it out. And I'm guessing there's probably a few people that listening to this that are also not joiners that are going, yeah, never. But I agree with you. I think you have to figure out, it may not be a support group, it may be an online community. It may be just, asking around and meeting people and making friends that way, but it is important. I am curious, Dewey, if, because you have been part of the support group for a while, you've seen people come and go, do you have any nuggets of wisdom that have come from the group that you feel like are valuable for other people living with IBD that you would pass on?
Millions. I mean, you're talking hours and hours of conversations, many, many, many patients. I think having listened to a number, although not all of the recent podcasts you guys have had, what one recurring theme, which is 1000% correct, and I think I even said this to someone online earlier today, was, listen, find an IBD specialist. We, for all the faults of this country's healthcare situation, the fact of the matter is, generally speaking, we as Americans have the freedom to go and find a doctor within the insurance plan that you belong to, but nonetheless, hopefully within the insurance plan that you belong to, you can locate an IBD specialist. I've been blessed in some senses that I've lived in two major metropolitan areas, New York City, San Francisco. So I've always had access to wonderful IBD doctors. But the country is huge, and there are people who live in, quite frankly, Missouri, Iowa. My friends who are out there who I'm talking about, what I'm talking about, who have to travel 2 hours to get to an IBD specialist. But when they have had an enormous change in their treatment process. Is it going to work immediately? Is it going to cure them? Of course, it's not going to cure them. We all know that. But will it hopefully improve the quality of life, the quality of treatments and their treatment plan? The answer is yes, without question. So please find an IBD specialist if you're not seeing an IBD specialist. And another, somewhere in the conversation, this thought came to, and it applies here too, is one of the key things, as I kind of alluded to way back in the beginning of the conversation, surgery, and Robin has said this specifically, and let's see if I can get to her exact words. Surgery is an option. Is it a preferred option? No one wants to volunteer for surgery. I was lucky that I was so sick that I was happy to have surgery, but most people aren't that sick necessarily, or they're in denial of being that sick, that when they're faced with the surgery option, they keep kicking the can down the road because they're scared, which is perfectly logical. And one of the biggest success stories I love talking about in the recent past is patients who who in the past couple of years have faced surgery or are kicking and screaming, don't want to have surgery because they're scared of it. And it's like, hopefully, and this is where the magic of having support group patients who, are doing okay today, who maybe had surgery, be part of the group to be able to say, look at so-and-so, they were scared like you are about facing surgery. They had surgery and they are so glad they did. There's always a small percentage of people who don't do well with surgery. That's just a sad medical fact. But most people end up having surgery to fix whatever the problem is, be it a colectomy, be it a resection, what have you, and end up feeling much better because of it. Not everyone, but most people. So if you're afraid of surgery, if you're facing surgery, if you've been told that you should have surgery and you're deathly afraid of the possibilities, generally speaking, it's definitely, as Robin said, it's an option. And sometimes it's a smart option.
Can I piggyback on that real quick?
Please.
And I don't know the percentage off the top of my head. Maybe this is something I'll have to look up. There is a certain percentage of IBD patients that will require surgery. I want to say 20% of ulcerative colitis patients, but it's more for Crohn's patients. And so, statistically, you should understand that it's a real possibility that you will have to have surgery. So I don't know. I just feel like being prepared for that in advance is a much better approach. But some people, like you said, they're scared of it. They're going kicking and screaming. And to be quite honest, I, wasn't super excited that I had to have surgery again, but I knew that the chances that I would have to have surgery again were statistically, not in my favor. I knew that it was more likely than not that I would have to have surgery again. So like you said, it's not like, do we want to have surgery? No, but I'm the kind of person who I would much rather understand that it's a real possibility and go into it knowing that, and go into it like talking to a surgeon about what that's going to look like if it's coming, down to that's closer to a possibility. And surgery recovery when you're not super sick is so much easier. If you're going into surgery and it's like that last resort and you're super sick, like coming out of it, you're going to feel better, but the recovery is going to be a lot harder too. So I get on surgery soapboxes so easily. It's just so much better if you go into it with your eyes open and try to prepare yourself for it and not wait till it's like the last resort.
Absolutely. And I don't know what the current numbers are, but the numbers for Crohn's patients were somewhere around as high as 60 or 70% were likely to have face surgery. UC patients, I think it were higher than 20 to 30 that you were talking about. And that's both those numbers have mitigated because of biologics and the advancements in treatment. But quite honestly, it's a stark reality. So yeah, no, I think that's a great description of it. The harsh reality is that there's a statistical likelihood that you may face surgery as an IBD patient. And if it ever gets to that conversation, quite frankly, if you're talking to an IBD specialist, they will probably introduce you to a surgeon well in advance. And this is the advantage of seeing an IBD specialist, because that specialist will realize what the math is, what the odds are, what your disease progression looks like, that you'll probably have to have a conversation with a surgeon and do it in advance of it being an emergent situation. So this way you become more comfortable with the idea, the concept, the surgeon, et cetera. Again, why go see an IBD specialist? That's another reason why, because they're going to know surgeons who are knowledgeable, capable, talented, who can help you.
Yeah. The conversations that I've got into with colorectal surgeons who work in IBD centers is, yes, they would prefer that this come up in conversation earlier, because yes, they want you to be healthier going into the surgery because it just makes your outcome that much better. Do people go into surgery when they're terribly sick like Dewey? Yes, of course they do. But, even Robin has talked about and Stacey have talked about in the course of their talking about their surgeries, things that their surgeon and dietitian and team had them doing to better prepare them for surgery to make the outcome as good as possible. And so even that, being able to do that in preparation for your surgery versus going in as emergency surgery, if you can help it is high, is certainly something you should look into. Okay. According to this article, which I will link in our show notes, 20% of patients, approximately 20% of patients with ulcerative colitis will require surgery, whereas up to 80% of Crohn's disease patients will undergo an operation during their lifetime. So chances are pretty darn good you're going to need something surgical.
I was going to say 75 for Crohn's, but I just wasn't sure about that. So
yeah, I thought it was 75 as well, but I need to find when this was published. This was in 2013.
Yeah, I bet you the numbers have marginally improved.
Hopefully.
That's interesting. I didn't realize that the UC number was that low. Sorry, Robin. Didn't mean to correct you incorrectly.
Well, the chances of me being wrong were high.
Well, we'll find the contemporary numbers here and see. But it does say this one is as of January 21st, 2022. This article says surgery risk for IBD declining in biologic era, but that doesn't mean zero. So yes,
That's
you
right.
are correct, Dewey, that these newer medications being better are making it so that people are avoiding surgery, which is of course ideal. Robin, any other IBD questions that you have?
I do not have any other IBD questions at this time, Alicia.
Okay, then I want to go down the fun fact route because in your fun fact, you said if you hadn't developed inflammatory bowel disease that you would work for the CIA. Are you joking?
Maybe. I don't know. So I remember distinctly the very first time I ran Team Challenge, the night before the race, we're sitting there talking to other patients, and an older woman, a woman who was older than I was at the time, she was probably on par with me in terms of the longevity of her disease, but that said, she was older than me. And she said, "So what has changed in your life? Has IBD affected your life? Like, would you have done or be doing something different if you didn't have IBD?" And this still sticks, this memory of this conversation sticks in my brain. Most things get excluded from my memory, but this does. And it was, well, you know what? I don't know. Maybe I would be in the CIA because, why not? I accidentally was a French major, so I had some language skills. Traveling internationally sounds like it's fun. I don't know.
Wait a minute. You were accidentally a Frenchman. I'm sorry. I have to pause you. I'm interrupting you to find out about this other aspect of a fun fact that you didn't mention. How do you accidentally become a French major?
Yeah, well, this is a little embarrassing, but the answer is I spent my junior year in France, so I had all these French credits in the bank. Came back senior year, I had statistics with a professor who was the most boring professor you could possibly have. Worse, that class was twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, right after lunch. And all of you people know that's nap time. So guess what Dewey started doing after he realized he was napping during class, which was, by the way, a 90-minute class because it was only twice a week. Like, you know what? Why take the time to go to class and nap? I'm just going to nap in my bed. By definition, I failed the class. It was a requirement for my economics major. Didn't become an economics major. The answer was easy second term, senior year. I was like, I'm going to become a French major.
I don't feel like that's embarrassing. I adore that. Do you still speak French?
I pretend to once in a while. I was once fluent in my life, but I'm not fluent. I can manage to come to an understanding without too much difficulty with a native only French speaking person.
Yes.
How do you
years
say
of French.
How do you say where's the bathroom in French?
I don't know. I can tell you in Spanish though.
¿Dónde está el baño?
Exactly.
La salle de bain is bathroom in French.
WC.
Yeah, that's it.
Water closet. Yeah,
All right, put it together.
Où est le WC?
There you go. Okay, thank you. Proceed back to CIA.
So yeah, that was my answer to, I think her name was Nina, Nina's question. It was like, yeah, I don't know, maybe I would be in the CIA because again, like travel the world on the government's dime, not your dime. I mean, sounds fantastic, and had that happened, honestly, maybe Ukraine would have happened if I had been in the CIA. I don't know. I'm just saying, we don't know.
Yes. This is true. I couldn't answer that question. Like if somebody said what I would be doing if I didn't have IBD, I have no idea how to answer that question because I don't know, still working in my family's restaurant, I would have taken over from my parents. I don't know. I don't know what I would be doing.
I think the reason why that answer came up was, I think the year prior or some recent time just before this conversation, there had been honestly an advertisement to work for the CIA. And I was like, I'd love to do this. But at the time I was a surgical patient, relatively new J-poucher, and I was like, I can't apply for the CIA. Can you? I mean, come on, facts are facts. Can you imagine like you're in the midst of a surveillance and you have to go to the bathroom? What are you doing? Time out. Everybody just wait 1 minute. Can we hit the pause button like they do on TV or the video, the DVR or whatever you want to call it, and just wait until I go to the bathroom. I'll be really quick because I have a J-pouch and I'll come back. Doesn't happen that way.
I mean, I have a feeling that people do have to go to the bathroom during surveillance. So, I mean, you probably wouldn't be the only person that has to do that. I'm just guessing. I am not in the CIA. So I'm,
sure? Or you can't talk about it.
That's right. That's right. That's a more accurate description. Yes.
There you go.
Maybe you have a buddy in those situations so that nobody misses anything. So yeah, but you're right. That is potentially a liability. And I do know in our conversation with Dr. Anish Patel that, unfortunately the military, you're not able to join the military if you've been diagnosed prior to being in the military. And oftentimes you get kicked out if you have it. So perhaps
honorably discharged, medically discharged. Don't say kicked out.
Kick you out. Yes, they honorably discharge you, medically discharge you. They don't just kick you out, but then they kick you out as soon as they discharge you. But I don't know if there's requirements for the CIA. Maybe I'll look into it and we'll see. I do know I'm too old to join the CIA now, which is such a disappointment, but it's okay. I also would be a terrible spy. I would be a terrible spy. I'm like not
I would
subtle.
probably be too. Yeah. But it's a fun idea to think about.
Yes,
right?
it is. I agree with you. Well, Dewey, we are running out of time. So, and you already answered this question sort of, but I'm going to ask you anyway. If you had one piece of advice for our IBD community, what would it be?
My favorite thing is a phrase that I've often used when patients are struggling. As Christopher Robin said to Pooh, as in Winnie the Pooh, but everyone likes to say Pooh when you're talking about IBD. You are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think. Something to always remember.
That is a really lovely phrase, and I think very fitting for our community. Well, Dewey, what an absolute pleasure to have you on. We really, really enjoyed our conversation with you. So thank you for joining us so very much. Thank you, everybody else in our community, for joining our podcast again. And so we're going to end it by saying cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Hi, this is Dewey. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, subscribe, and share with a friend or many friends.